A father attempted to publicly humiliate a woman into relinquishing her seat. However, the situation became unmanageable when the flight attendant advocated for her. Keisha Monroe gently exhaled as she settled into her window seat in row 14 of the overcrowded Airbus A320. She had deliberately selected it, paying an additional fee for the tranquility and comfort it offered. In the midst of the typical pandemonium of air travel, the window was her escape, a small sanctuary. She had arrived with a simple expectation of being left alone, noise-canceling headphones, and a new novel, as she was anticipating a lengthy flight. The cabin was a hive of activity as passengers rearranged themselves at the last minute when they boarded. The usual pre-flight announcements echoed over the intercom, flight attendants moved swiftly through the corridors, and overhead compartments slammed shut. Keisha adjusted her seatbelt and perused the initial pages of her book, allowing the background noise of the conversation to recede. She scarcely noticed the father and child as they made their way down the aisle until they halted directly in front of her. Her concentration was interrupted by a deep voice that was firm and expectant, a command that was disguised as a request. "Excuse me. I need you to move." Keisha glanced upwards and blinking. The male, who was middle-aged and well-dressed, was visibly impatient and towered over her. His salt and pepper hair was meticulously combed, his expensive wristwatch gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the way he held himself exuded entitlement, as if he were accustomed to receiving his desires without question. A small girl, no older than 6, stood beside him, holding a stuffed rabbit against her bosom. She avoided Keisha's gaze by fidgeting with the hem of her sweater and had wide, apprehensive eyes. Keisha hesitated. "I'm sorry?" The man sighed, as if to clarify an apparent point. He pointed to the vacant aisle seat adjacent to her. "My daughter experiences anxiety during flights," he stated, his tone indicating that there was no space for negotiation. Keisha raised her eyebrows slightly. She alternated her attention between the infant and the man. "I apologize," she stated, maintaining a steady yet authoritative tone in her voice. "I paid for this seat." Richard Aldridge, whose name she recognized from the frequent flyer badge affixed to his carry-on, appeared incredulous for a brief period, as if the notion of being told no was an entirely alien concept. His countenance then became inflexible. "She is a child," he reiterated, this time with a slowed pace, as if Keisha had not comprehended his previous statement. "Surely you understand." Keisha's cheeks were pressed together. She comprehended the material without difficulty. She comprehended that a mature man, who could afford a Rolex and a first-class leather briefcase, had somehow neglected to consider his daughter's requirements. She accepted that he believed she would accommodate him without inquiry. And she comprehended that his approach may have been altered if she had been any other individual, including a different race or age. Nevertheless, she maintained a reserved tone in her voice. She stated, "I comprehend. But I also paid for my seat. If it was that important, you should have booked accordingly." Richard's lips curved into a tight, humorless smile. "Unbelievable," he murmured, shaking his head. He then spoke more loudly, ensuring that the people in the vicinity could hear him, a deliberate maneuver intended to portray her as the issue. He stated, "This is the issue with people today. They lack basic decency." The words remained suspended in the air, serving as a challenge. Nearby passengers moved uncomfortably, with some turning their heads. A few individuals darted a fleeting glimpse at Keisha, their faces a combination of awkwardness and curiosity. Keisha experienced an ascending sensation of heat in her face. She was acutely aware of his actions, which caused her intestines to contract. However, a shadow entered the aisle adjacent to them before she could respond. A flight attendant had arrived. However, the subsequent events would astound all. The flight attendant, a woman in her late 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor and keen eyes, halted beside them. Sandra Wallace's name badge was affixed to her navy blue uniform, which was impeccably ironed. She peered between Keisha and the man who was standing stiffly beside her, absorbing the tension, much like a seasoned referee entering a brewing fight. She inquired, her voice composed yet authoritative, "Is there an issue here?" Richard Aldridge intervened prior to Keisha's words. "Yes," he replied, crossing his arms. "This woman won't give up her seat for my daughter." Sandra's eyebrows slightly raised, as if she anticipated his subsequent discussion of the matter. Richard exhaled deeply and then gestured toward the young female. "She gets anxious during flights. She needs the window seat. I asked this young lady to switch, but she refused." Sandra was attentively observed by Keisha, who was on the lookout for any indication of favoritism or disrespect. Flight attendants faced a challenging task of reconciling airline policies with customer satisfaction, which occasionally necessitated accommodating the most vocal passenger. However, Sandra appeared unimpressed. She directed her gaze toward Keisha. "You booked this seat?" Keisha acknowledged. "Yes." Sandra returned to Richard. "Sir, she has the seat assigned to her," Richard sneered. "I'm aware of that. I'm asking you to do the right thing and help us resolve this situation. Surely the airline values customer service." Sandra's patience was fraying as she inhaled slowly. "Sir, customer service doesn't mean forcing another passenger to move from a seat they paid for." Richard's face flushed, but he was not about to concede so readily. "This is not about regulations," he stated, his voice increasing just enough to attract the attention of the passengers in the vicinity. "This is about decency, about kindness, about a grown woman refusing to accommodate a child." The manner in which he articulated it, as if Keisha were some sort of villain, caused a sudden surge of frustration in her. Sandra, on the other hand, maintained her composure. "I comprehend your apprehension, sir," she replied, unperturbed by his antics. "If you need a window seat for your daughter, I'd be happy to check if there are any open ones available. But I won't ask another passenger to move from their assigned seat." Richard's mandible was clenched. He turned to Keisha, his eyes narrowing. "You really won't move for a child?" Keisha's voice was steady yet unyielding as she met his gaze. "I have paid for this seat," she reiterated. "I'm staying in it." Richard shook his head and let out a brief, humorless guffaw. Subsequently, he elevated his voice as he observed the other passengers. He asked no one in particular, "Is this true?" A full-grown woman refusing to switch seats with a little girl. The cabin was filled with murmurs. Eye contact was avoided by certain passengers, who evidently did not wish to engage in conflict. Others observed with curiosity. Keisha experienced a sensation of unease that enveloped her, not because she was uncertain about her decision, but because this was the manner in which individuals such as Richard operated. He was not merely attempting to secure a seat, he was also attempting to intimidate her into submission. Finally, the most detrimental aspect? It is possible that it would function. Her book was tightly grasped by her hands. She could sense the weight of each gaze, the unspoken pressure to be the larger person, the expectation. However, why was it always she who was required to be the more powerful individual? Sandra's discreet yet evident demonstration of support was evident as she approached Keisha, suggesting that she had detected the change. "Sir," she said, her voice low and firm, "I'm going to ask you one last time to take your assigned seat." Richard's nostrils flared as he exhaled sharply, and he then murmured something under his breath. Keisha failed to comprehend the initial portion, however, she comprehended the final phrase, "a common occurrence." Her stomach plummeted. Sandra's posture underwent a complete transformation, her lips were tightened into a narrow line. Suddenly, the entire row fell silent, as if everyone had also heard it. Keisha felt her pulse pounding in her ears. Sandra and she were both familiar with the meaning of that term, as they had encountered it numerous times. The flight attendant's eyes were fixed on Richard as she straightened her shoulders, her calm professionalism being displaced by a colder demeanor. "I would suggest that you exercise extreme caution in your implied meaning," she advised, her voice resonating with determination. The cabin's vitality underwent a transformation. The murmurs transitioned into whispering. However, before any further discussion could occur, an additional voice entered the conversation, which would have a profound impact. The tension was broken by a voice from the row behind them. A man spoke up, his tone even yet firm, and she stated that she paid for her seat. Keisha turned slightly, catching a sight of the speaker. He was a middle-aged man who was seated in an aisle seat with his arms crossed. He was wearing a dark green hoodie and wire-rimmed spectacles. He was not gazing at Richard, rather, he was gazing at Sandra, as if anticipating that she would resolve this matter definitively. Sandra acknowledged the assistance with a slight bow, but she maintained her attention on Richard. "Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your voice," she indicated. Richard abruptly exhaled, shaking his head in disbelief at the events that transpired. He directed his frustration toward the expanding audience. "This is absurd," he exclaimed, gesturing in an attempt to locate potential allies. "No one here thinks it's wrong for a grown woman to refuse to switch seats with a 6-year-old? A few passengers appeared to be uneasy as they adjusted in their seats, however, no one else expressed any discomfort. Richard was not satisfied with that. "This is the issue with society today," he continued, his voice resonating down the aisle. "People are so selfish, so unwilling to do something small to help someone else." Keisha experienced a surge of fury in her chest, which was not solely due to the content of his words, but also because she could sense the implicit pressure he was attempting to exert on her. She observed the manner in which certain passengers avoided direct eye contact with her and how others hesitated as if they were contemplating his words. It would be effortless for them to align themselves with him, to present this as an issue of fundamental benevolence rather than entitlement. In an effort to turn her into the antagonist, Keisha steadied herself by inhaling slowly. "I am not self-centered," she stated, her voice remaining composed but unyielding. "I paid for this seat just like everyone else here. If the seat was so important, you should have booked it ahead of time." The man in the green hoodie nodded slightly, as if content with her response. Richard was, however, exceedingly dissatisfied. "You have no shame," he murmured, his face flushing red with frustration, "do you?" Keisha's fingers pressed into the cover as she tightened her grasp on her book. Subsequently, a woman to the opposite side of the aisle declared her presence. The woman's voice resonated throughout the cabin as she declared, "She is correct. Seats aren't assigned randomly. If you wanted the window, you should have booked it." Richard abruptly turned his head in her direction, his frustration altering his focus. "She is a child," he reiterated, his voice becoming increasingly strained. "I shouldn't have to plan around selfish people." Keisha exhaled quietly, endeavoring to maintain her composure. She had previously encountered this strategy, the manipulation of the situation to make it about morality or the refusal of the evil person to accommodate the good person. However, there was a change in situation. Richard was now being observed by an increasing number of passengers, who were displaying a range of emotions, from irritation to blatant hostility. Some individuals murmured amongst themselves, shaking their heads, and Richard could feel it. He experienced a minor loss of confidence. However, Sandra intervened prior to his recuperation. "I require you to assume your designated seat immediately, sir," she stated, her demeanor being solemn. Richard halted. He was aware that he was losing ground, but he was unwilling to relinquish his position without making one final effort. He returned to Keisha, his voice subdued but tinged with malice. He stated, "You know what? Please maintain your seat. I wouldn't want my daughter sitting next to someone like you anyway." The words struck her with a greater force than she had suspected. Keisha was not the only individual who observed the cold, sharp anger that rose in her bosom. Sandra's posture immediately became rigid. "That concludes it," she declared, her tone resonant with authority. "Sir, I need you to come with me." Richard was startled and blinking. "What? You can either move to your assigned seat now, or we'll have to speak with the captain." A novel form of tension permeated the atmosphere, the type that arises when an individual recognizes that they have exceeded their limits. Richard's mouth was agape, but no words were uttered. He appeared to be genuinely uncertain for the first time since the onset of this situation. However, uncertainty was not synonymous with surrender, and Richard Aldridge was not the type of individual to readily relinquish control. Something was on the brink of failure. Richard Aldridge stood motionless for a brief period, his expression alternately expressing disbelief and indignation. He had not anticipated the sudden turn of the throng, the pressure, or the pushback. And now, with Sandra's voice firm and unwavering, the authority he believed he possessed. It was slighting. He repeated, his voice now lowered, "You would like me to accompany you?" As if he were evaluating the extent of her authority. Sandra maintained her composure. "Yes, sir." Keisha could observe the transformation as it occurred in real time, as Richard's intellect was in the process of determining his subsequent course of action. He was acutely aware that he was perilously close to exacerbating his own circumstances. However, males were fond of him, they did not enjoy losing. Rather than stand aside, he played his final card. "I simply find it intriguing," he stated, increasing his voice once more. "That you're siding with her? I bet if the roles were reversed, we'd be having a very different conversation." The cabin's atmosphere became more dense. Keisha felt her stomach contort, but she refrained from reacting. She refused to provide him with the gratification. However, Sandra had exhausted her playing time. "Sir, I am issuing a warning," she stated, her voice becoming more stern and icy. "If you do not take your seat right now, I will have to notify the captain. And if that happens, I can't guarantee you'll remain on this flight." The volume of the murmurs increased. Passengers were now intently observing, leaning forward and whispering. Additionally, "Richard?" It resonated with him. For the first time, tangible repercussions were imminent. He turned, gazing down the aisle toward the cockpit as if he could somehow determine the gravity of Sandra's situation. Subsequently, he encountered an even more detrimental circumstance. A different flight attendant, another voice. Sandra was followed by a tall, broad-shouldered male who was dressed in the same Navy uniform as her. His name tag was inscribed with the name Javier. He queried, his voice polite but tinged with authority, "Is there an issue here?" Richard maintained eye contact with Sandra. "Not yet," she replied. But I was just explaining to this passenger that if he refuses to take his assigned seat, we'll need to escalate the situation. Javier's expression remained unaltered, however, his presence altered the entire energy of the situation. This was no longer merely a dispute between a passenger and a flight attendant, it had become an official issue. Keisha, a mute observer of Richard's internal conflict, observed it unfold. He was determined to resist this, his entire being begged him to persist. However, it was no longer solely about prestige. He was now contemplating the possibility of being denied boarding the aircraft. Additionally, that was an excessive measure. His posture marginally sagged for the first time. It was acquiescence, not surrender, at least not in its entirety. "That is satisfactory," he murmured. Subsequently, without uttering another word, he turned, strode down the aisle to his seat, and grasped his daughter's hand a bit too tightly. A modest sigh of relief was emitted by a few passengers. Others exchanged knowing glimpses as they shook their heads. Sandra slowly exhaled, allowing herself to regain her composure before returning her attention to Keisha. She apologized, her tone becoming more empathetic. Keisha gestured her gratitude with a modest inclination. "Not your fault." Sandra hesitated briefly before stating, "Please inform me immediately if he continues to cause you distress." Once again, Keisha nodded. Sandra and Javier disembarked and vanished toward the front of the aircraft. Keisha experienced a minor sense of relaxation for the first time since the onset of this incident. However, just as she was about to return to her novel, a voice from across the aisle captivated her. "You handled that well," the woman with the ponytail said, offering a small, knowing smile. Keisha exhaled a brief breath, which was somewhere between a chuckle and a groan. "I guess." Nevertheless, the woman shook her head. "No, seriously. A lot of people would have just moved to avoid the hassle. You didn't." Keisha refrained from responding immediately, as she had contemplated the matter. There was a moment, a genuine, incontrovertible moment, when she felt the pressure to yield. To merely relocate. Release it. Facilitate the process. However, she had not. And now. It was over. Or so she believed. However, Richard Aldridge was not yet finished. Keisha exhaled slowly, repositioning herself in her seat. However, the tension in her shoulders persisted. Despite Richard's abrupt departure and Sandra's assurance that she had committed no infractions, the entire situation left her with an acrid taste in her mouth. She peered at his seat, which was situated on the opposite side of the aisle, 4 rows in advance. He was rigidly seated, with his arms crossed and his mandible clenched. His daughter, who was still holding her teddy rabbit, sat beside him, looking down and remaining silent. Keisha experienced a brief moment of emotion, perhaps compassion. The girl had not requested any of this. She had recently been entangled in her father's troubles. However, the moment Richard turned his head, he captured her gaze and sneered, depriving her of any sympathy she may have had. He spoke out loud. Keisha did not hear it, however, she was not obligated to. She was aware of the tone. Recognized the appearance. He dismissed her with an abrupt, dismissive shake of his head, as if she were beneath him. It was as though she was the issue. She returned to the window, grasping the armrest. She was not going to allow him to reach her. She declined. But then, he did something that she did not anticipate. Richard rose from his seat. Passengers in his pew looked up in confusion. A flight attendant situated near the front promptly observed the situation. She approached him and said, "Sir, I require that you remain seated." Richard did not pay attention. He proceeded directly past her, proceeding down the aisle in the direction of Keisha. The energy transition was immediate. The heads of passengers were turned. He was observed by the eyes. Sandra, who had been assisting an elderly couple with their luggage, became tense upon observing him approaching. Keisha refrained from moving. Refused to respond. However, her pulse increased rapidly and abruptly. What was he doing? Richard halted at her row, firmly grasping the seat in front of her and slightly leaning in. The tension was tangible. For a brief moment, they were the only ones, fighting silently. Then, he spoke. "You must be really proud of yourself." Keisha did not blink, flinch, or provide him with the gratification of reacting. Rather, she raised her eyebrow. "Excuse me?" Richard exhaled abruptly, as if he were scarcely maintaining his composure. He murmured, "You are sitting here pretending to be the victim," with a voice that was just low enough for her to hear. "But we both know what's really going on." Keisha's fingertips began to curl into the armrest. This was no longer about the seat. It was never the case. This was a matter of control, ego, and a man who had never been told no before and was now disintegrating as a result. Keisha opened her mouth to respond, but Sandra's voice interrupted her before she could. "Sir, step away from the passenger seat now." The directive was concise, conclusive. Richard refrained from moving. Initially, Keisha believed that he was going to escalate the situation to a more severe level. However, Javier returned, and this time, he was not inquiring. "Sir, if you don't return to your seat immediately, we'll have no choice but to remove you from the aircraft." The cabin was enveloped in a collective silence. Keisha could sense the weight of each passenger's gaze. This was no longer merely an argument, it was a spectacle. Richard's complexion was an intense shade of scarlet. His chest rose and his lips parted for a brief moment, as if he were about to dispute. However, he quickly made a decision. He murmured, "You're unbelievable," as he directed one final glance at Keisha. Subsequently, he abruptly retreated to his seat, turning on his heel. Javier observed him throughout the entire journey. Sandra inhaled. "Are you okay?" Keisha eventually exhaled, unaware that she had been holding her breath. Despite the fact that her hands were still tense, she stated, "I am fine." Sandra acknowledged once before exchanging a glance with Javier. And then, as Javier reached for his radio, Richard committed one final error. He murmured something. "The volume is insufficient to accommodate the entire aircraft." Insufficiently boisterous for the passengers in front of him. However, the volume was sufficient for Sandra and Javier to hear. Sandra's rapid inhalation was audible enough for Keisha to detect. Javier's countenance underwent an immediate transformation. Javier proceeded without hesitation. He elevated his earpiece to his mouth. "Captain, we have a situation." Richard Aldridge's flight was abruptly terminated prior to its commencement. The cabin's tension reached a suffocating level. Passengers discontinued their muttering. Some individuals leaned forward in their seats, while others craned their necks to observe the upcoming events. Javier's radio sounded like it was on fire. "Copy that. Hold him at the front until we can coordinate with ground staff." Keisha's heart beat rapidly. Sandra and Javier moved swiftly, approaching Richard, who remained seated with his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if he were refusing to acknowledge the events that were unfolding. "Sir," Javier replied, his tone remaining composed yet unyielding. "I need you to collect your belongings and step into the jet bridge." Richard did not respond. "Sir," Sandra attempted to persuade him to cooperate one final time. Nothing. Passengers exchanged apprehensive glances. The young girl seated next to him held her stuffed rabbit in her arms, her gaze alternating between her father and the flight personnel. Keisha felt a sensation in her chest. Not pity. Not sympathy. However, fatigue. It should never have progressed to this extent. A seat. It was merely a seat. However, the situation had escalated into this due to the refusal of one man to take a negative response. Javier pushed in. "Mr. Aldridge, if you refuse to comply, we will be forced to call security." That concluded the matter. Richard's hands gripped the armrest so closely that his knuckles turned white as he sucked in a sharp breath. He then slowly, painfully, unbuckled his seatbelt. He stood with his mandible clenched and his shoulders tensed in humiliation. Javier stepped aside to allow him to pass, saying, "Let's go." Richard made a single stride forward before he hesitated. Keisha briefly believed that he was about to turn and address her. However, he subsequently shook his head and proceeded to depart. Passengers observed him being escorted to the front of the aircraft in silence. Keisha exhaled, unaware that she had been suppressing her breath. Sandra continued to hesitate for an additional second. "If you need anything, let us know." Keisha acknowledged. "Thank you." Subsequently, the flight attendant reversed direction and pursued Javier toward the front. The murmurs commenced immediately upon their departure. Passengers conversed in whispers, with some of them shaking their heads and others murmuring words that Keisha was unable to discern. However, a voice from the opposite side of the aisle interrupted. "About time," the woman with the ponytail murmured, shaking her head. A low chuckle was emitted by a male in the row behind her. He had that coming. A small number of individuals nodded in accord. However, Keisha simply turned back toward her window, allowing the moment to fully settle in. She was not pleased of the events that transpired. She was also dissatisfied with the situation. She was simply fatigued. She was aware that the outcome of this narrative could have been very different if she had reacted differently, raised her voice, or engaged in any activity other than sitting peacefully and maintaining her composure. That was the most painful aspect. However, she did not harbor any remorse for the stress, confrontation, or degradation that Richard had attempted to inflict upon her. Due to the fact that she had not relocated in the end. And that was sufficient. This narrative is not solely about a man who became enraged over a seat. It is a matter of control. Regarding the ego. Regarding the manner in which certain individuals will resort to any means necessary to circumvent rejection. Occasionally, individuals such as Keisha may perceive the act of declining, standing firm, refusing to yield, and resisting pressure, as an act of defiance. However, this is not the case. Respect is indispensable. This is not subject to negotiation. Additionally, there are instances in which the most effective course of action is to remain in one's current location. I am interested in hearing about any experiences you have had or have witnessed that are similar to this. Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. Additionally, if you are interested in reading additional stories of this nature, please consider subscribing, as there is always more to discuss.